Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Today is a Comprehensivist Wednesday. We do this series in conjunction with the Greater Philadelphia Thinking Society. And today we are going to be talking about language as interpretation. These are ideas of Walter Ong. What I'm going to do is that we did meet up on this Sunday, where Sara was here. She actually co-edited a book by Walter Ong, which she and her co-author Tom published posthumously. This was the last manuscript, full book-length manuscript that Father Ong left behind, which summarizes his thought about language. So what I'm going to do is that there are many of us here who attended the meetup. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to highlight actually 3 ideas from the meetup. Not from the meetup, but these are core ideas of Walter Ong. And then I'm going to invite people who have first those who have attended the meetup or watched the video of it to talk about their take on those ideas or Walter Ong's ideas. And then we're going to have a general discussion. Now, even if you have never heard about Walter Ong, you will see as soon as I describe the ideas, this is something that we deal with every day. What Walter Ong does is that he actually shows you how this everyday thing actually works. Okay, so it's on one hand, it is extremely familiar. We're just talking about language that we are all using all the time. At the same time, it is incredibly deep because language is fundamental to who we are and how we operate. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Walter Ong wrote a book called Orality and Literacy, where he traced the movement from orality to literacy and looked at how language and how people think changed as a result of that. He also carried out that analysis from purely oral culture to invention of writing, and then to invention of printing, which scales up the writing massively, and then use of electronic technology, electrical technology like television, what that did to language. He calls it the secondary orality. And then finally, the internet, which is like a secondary literacy and what it is doing now. So that's one of the large themes in his work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present 3 ideas of his very briefly. First idea is I strongly recommend that you use pen and paper, because that's a great way of keeping track of all the ideas. There are going to be so many ideas that are going to come at you, and you're going to have so many ideas. So there's no other way of keeping track of all of them. This is highly interactive meetup. So you will be able to talk about these ideas with others. So the format is that in the initial stage, I'm doing this introduction. Everybody who has watched the video or has participated in the meetup is going to comment on what they got from Walter Ong, what they learned from Walter Ong. After that, we are going to go into breakout. We have maybe a few questions, and then we're going to go into breakout rooms. We're going to have, gather in groups of 6 or 8 to discuss these ideas of language deeply. And then we're going to come back, and then we raise all the questions we have about language. Then we go through these lightning round where we try to answer all the questions, okay? So that's the plan. So let me put on the table the 3 ideas. The first idea I have is actually a matrix. So on your piece of paper, if you could draw this, you can put oral, and here you can put written, okay? So this is on the right-hand side, this is on the left-hand side, just kind of right brain and left brain, if you will, okay? Oral and written. And here at the top, you say yourself, and here with others, okay? Just this map. So I want to discuss, how firstly oral language works versus written language works, and how each of these work within ourselves for our own thinking and in collaboration with other people. Okay, so that matrix is the first point that I would like to discuss. Now, the great thing is that all of this is incredibly familiar with everybody. May not have thought much about it. Some people would have thought a lot about it. Some people may not have thought about it, but everybody does this, okay? That's the first point. The second point, second and third point, actually, I'm taking directly from Sara, because I asked Sara, what are the key contributions of Walter Ong? And she said there are two things. And those are the two things I wanted to add as the point number 2 and point number 3 to coalesce the discussion around. So the second point is that technology shapes how we think. So the technology we use for the language shapes how our consciousness works, how we use our mind. Okay, so this is about moving from oral culture to the written culture. What does writing do? So for example, I can talk about it at a personal level. I write a lot, and I consider writing to be indispensable to my thinking, because what writing does is it allows me to externalize my thinking. So I can put it down on a piece of paper and I can look at it outside of myself, which is a lot easier to do as opposed to when it is going on inside your mind, to be able to observe it at the same time. So it allows you the distance, it allows you to self-reflect on your thought. It allows you to organize it. It allows you to say, is it precise? Have I actually captured everything that I want to say? What am I missing? How is it connected to these other things? So it raises the level of precision, the comprehensiveness of our writing, of our thinking. So it dramatically changes how we work. And once we are a writing creature, the way we speak also gets transformed by it. So there is a causality of that. In connection with this, there is a crucial point that Walter Ong makes, and that is the distinction between digitization and interpretation. What writing does is that it digitizes, it makes it very specific, it puts it down, it separates all the units. The orality is all about flow. It is all about talking about things that we have not, which are barely at the edge of our consciousness. So there is this dance in language between achieving specificity and bringing in a lot of meaning that is at the edge of your consciousness. And one of the key points of Walter Ong is that it is that process of relentless interpretation that keeps language alive. This interpretation, you can think of them as feedback loops. This happens even when you're speaking and you're kind of aware of what you're speaking. It happens when you write and you're observing what you're writing. So these both are at the top part of this 4-part division within yourself. And they're absolutely the same kind of things that are happening, feedback loops across people. When you're talking to somebody and if you're actually listening to them, they are giving you a context which is different from yours, that allows you, if you choose to take the opportunity of expanding your context, even the simple effort of trying to communicate to somebody else, you will notice that your mind automatically starts to broaden the context, trying to ground what you're saying for another consciousness. And that itself is a giant leap forward. If on the top of that, you actually hear the other person talk about the same thing, that expands the context further. Not everything is clear to both parties instantly. Did you mean this or did you mean that? Oh, I don't agree with this, I agree with that. that process of going back and forth with a person shapes our thoughts. So this is, oral with other people. Then there is written with other people. You're reading and you're writing in response to that. You're trying to summarize what somebody else is saying. You're trying to put in your own words what you got from it. You're engaging in a dialogue with multiple writers on a topic. So that flow. But the thing that is common to all of this is this cycle of feedback loops, of interpretation. And Walter Ong is arguing that that is crucial to language. That is essential to what language is. Language is not about just naming something and then going on to the next thing. It is a process of interpreting the world. Okay, so that's a very profound view of language, and I want to analyze it in that four-part diagram, where at the top, on the left, on the right-hand side, so there is the oral and written in a horizontal axis, and there is yourself and with others in the vertical axis. And I want to look at all those four quadrants and see how language's interpretation works in all of them. We have, all of us, whether we have heard of Walter Ong, or we have thought, whether or not we have thought much about language, we've all engaged in this. So that's what we're going to use, all that experience, okay? The second point that we're going to look at is how technology shapes. So we'll go through the oral culture to the written culture, where all writing was manuscript, handwritten, then to printing culture, then to television, and then to internet, and to see how language transforms at each of these levels, okay? And finally, one of the critical observations of Walter Ong is that everything is connected to everything. So the way you use language, his idea of interpretation is based on that you're trying to capture relationships relentlessly. You're never done. You are continuously trying to interpret nature. So those are the points that I see as being critical to Walter Ong. And I want to shape the discussion along this. But before we go into that, I want to invite people who either attended the meetup or watched the video to share what they got about language from Walter Ong and Sara. So go ahead and folks, for those who are new here, we have 4 simple rules that we have used for the last 5 years that work very well to foster a very deep conversation, regardless of our differences of view. First rule, type exclamation mark in chat or raise your hand in Zoom in order to speak. Rule number 2, keep on topic. We are discussing the nature of language at the deepest possible level. Rule number 3, be brief. There are incredible number of great people here. You want to hear them speak, not just hear yourself speak. So please keep what you have to say brief, so you can hear as many other viewpoints as you can, and other people can process what you're saying most effectively. Number 4, feel free to speak your mind. Disagree with anybody on anything, and do so courteously. Okay, so those are the 4 rules. All right, so what did you guys think of Sara and Walter Ong? Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to share your thoughts. Looks like many of you have attended these meetups, the meetup, and some watch the video. So go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to. If you don't want to give an overall comment, you're welcome to talk about in a more limited way. If you want, if you currently only for people who have either attended the meetup or watch the video, and then we'll open it up for everybody. So it's going to be Joe followed by Patricia. Joe.
I only got through the first 15 minutes of video. Unfortunately, I didn't get to see the whole video. But what I will say is the importance of technology was what she highlighted in those first 15 minutes. And, you know, the little that I know about Walter Ong, I also get a lot of feeling of Marshall McLuhan in his work. So I think there's a connection there. Even what we're drawing this right now, I'm trying to figure out if that could fit into a tetrad. But anyway, that's just an initial thought.
Absolutely. Thank you, Joe. So Walter Ong was a student of Marshall McLuhan. He was a graduate student of Marshall McLuhan. And then Marshall McLuhan suggested that he do a detailed work on this one guy called Ramy. So there is a tremendous influence. They were friends, they talked all the time, and they have influenced each other a great deal. So you're right on focusing on that. And also, yes, I mean the technology is a huge part. Most of his work has focused on the early part of technology. That's what the orality and literacy is all about. There is another gentleman called Eric Havelock, who also has very deep ideas about this. He has written a book called, what is it called? Preface to Plato. And Plato, for example, relating to this idea of oral versus oral and written, Plato, for example, banned poets from his republic because they were engaged in telling stories. This is Homer. What he thought that mythos is opposed to logos. So you can either tell stories or you can think clearly in words. And so that is a very clear distinction between orality and literacy that he was pushing for. Now, of course, when you look at other people, like, for example, if you look at Bible, that's not true at all in Bible. The logos and mythos go together. So these stories are allegories, which are actually illustrating the explicit principles that are explicated using logos. So the relationship between the writing and the oral, there are different views on that. And it's a profound field. And this is just looking at the technology of writing. And when you go to the print, it goes to a completely new level. And then when you go again to television, it goes to a new level. When you go to internet, it goes to the new level. So wonderful. Thank you very much, Joe. Joe, you had something?
I was just going to say the other part that I had gathered was the importance of how this improves literacy and what that means for the rest of the culture. The implications behind that. So that's the only thing I was going to add as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Next up is going to be Patricia, followed by David Norton. Patricia.
Yes, hi, thank you. I really enjoyed learning about Walter Ong. My big takeaway was, and I think it was one of the takeaways or questions that we ended the meeting with, was Mark Stallman's question about what is secondary literacy. That really piqued my curiosity because, obviously with the secondary orality, with the, television and writing having an influence on that, how is it influencing, the written word now? But what I actually looked it up to try and see, whether there has been any follow-up. And I found the term tertiary orality as opposed to secondary orality, which is kind of in terms of thinking like Twitter and Instagram, they're more, they're almost kind of, again, with the tetrads, reverting, back to an oral culture, because it is much more of a dialogue. You have people arguing on Twitter, and it's not really real time, but it's almost immediate. And I think for me, that was a key point. When you brought up about self and others, I think that's another key point of Walter Ong with the I and the thou. And how the interpersonal and how language basically is about communication between two people. You know, yes, you can have an internal conversation with yourself or journal in writing, but it's also, now I lost my train of thought, but there's just so many things with the communication and what we miss in language by writing that we gain in person, and how much, you know, communication is 80% or more body language. So I think that there's just a lot of, it really raised a lot of questions for me as to what our environment is now. What is our digital environment teaching us, showing us, and I think we need to improve it. So those are some of my thoughts.
Fantastic, Patricia. I mean, absolutely. I like everything that you're saying. I mean, these are all the big questions. You know, we are going through massive technological change. In some ways, the internet actually subsumes all these media. And it's a question of what proportion. I mean, the one term that Walter Ong or Sara or Mark Stallman use is that of media ecology, or Marshall McLuhan use. So it's best to think of it as media ecology. And how are you, what ecology are you going to use to be more effective? Because each of these media have very positive, you know, tremendously powerful characteristics. Like, for example, writing, the specificity of it, the clarity of it, the transmittability, it's just incredible. At the same time, it is more static. So whereas oral communication is far more flexible, and it is, you know, you can grope at, you know, trying to figure out what you mean. And you can do that, you know, in an interactive way, in a much more fluid fashion. So there is a fluidity to it, which writing does not have. So it's kind of, the question is, at the same time, you can use writing for one thing. For example, one of the things I've been experimenting with is to use writing as questions and speak out the answers. So that's one thing, one idea that I'm following up on. So it's a question of how do you use all these? But one of the critical things is to be aware. The first thing is to be aware of the impact of all these media on yourself. So what happens to your mind when you subject yourself to a lot of speech that is just coming in and you're just watching it in TV, for example? Instead of a back and forth conversation, you're just taking in stuff that somebody else is saying that you do not even know. What is the impact of that on how your mind works? So, and this applies to, and you can ask this question of everything. You can ask it about Facebook, you can ask it about Twitter, you can ask it about reading a book, you can ask it about talking to your loved ones. What it does, you know, what are the positive things? What are the negative things? What are the limits of it? So fantastic. So next up is going to be David, Norton, Laura, Jade, Abraham, and Madeline. David.
Yeah, I just love this topic. When I watched this video this afternoon, I was quite amazed at the way he had broken down, you know, these various things in language. And, you know, before when you were talking the difference of logos, and I guess they use the word mythos, which is really talking about a Greek mythology or any mythology, really. You know, there are two different kinds of forms of communication, you know, to me. You know, when you look up the Greek word logos biblically, it basically shows that the word logos is a person's speech. But another word that's also used for the same thing is called rhema, which off the top of my head, I'm not familiar with it. But on the other hand, you know, when you're looking at the Greek mythology, okay, to me, that those were a lot of those stories of Homer were passed down orally until he documented these stories. And the thing is, when you have an oral understanding of something, all of the inflections and all of the character of the person becomes put into that oral presentation. And the thing is, when people are learning oral presentations one from another, there's far more tendency to take on so many of the different expressions and stuff that can contain, within that story. So therefore, to me, something that's presented orally, that's not just read off from a paper or whatever, has far more, what do you say, a spirit that gets transferred to whoever's listening to it. And it means so much more. Some of the Greek stories, like I just love the one between Narcissus and Echo, and I'm sure everybody's familiar with that, but it really defines the two words in a story in such a way that a definition could never do. Because when you come out of the story, the myth, okay, you're thinking about you're picturing that whole thing and what's happening. Now, depending upon the person that's telling the story will make a big difference too as to how it's perceived by the person. But even just reading it, and there's so many different Greek stories that are like that, I just love the stories because a lot of the foundation of the words that we use today come from these Greek mythological stories. And people have no idea that that's where they existed. Like the Song of the Sirens, there's sirens all over. And I tell you what, the meaning of that is still the same as it was when the story was told. But the only thing is the story goes far more in depth than what we, than just hearing a siren, So anyway, I just love this topic. And, there's so many different things that can be broken down and talked about within inside of this.
Absolutely. What will, yeah, go ahead.
That I'm not going to go on much more. And the thing is, when you start transferring these from, oral stories to writings, okay, and then also to the electronic media, there's such a thing that takes place that it really, to me, corrupts the original story.
Wonderful. Yeah. So David, we'll have plenty of opportunity to explore this in great amount of detail. So one point I want to address before we go to Laura, Jade, Abram, and Madeline is the character of the oral stories. We had Merlin Donald here. He talks about different stages of human beings. The first stage is mimetic stage, imitative stage. The second stage is oral stage. The third one is external memory. Okay. Now, when you look at a story, right, the way in which, for example, the Homeric stories were told, they're told with the full body. They're told with the full body, the tone of the voice, but more than that, it is told with a personality. It is communicating a character. It is communicating a way of being. And so it is the entire thing is at the kind of high definition level. And it is like a holistic level of presenting your entire being. And whereas, and it surrounds you completely. It speaks to your body, it speaks to your emotions, it speaks to your mind, and does that in a fluid way. It is taking place in the context of other people. You're actually using those stories to communicate with one another, and those stories are forming the backbone of your interaction. So that is the depth of what is there. What writing does, especially alphabetic writing, is abstracted. And there are its limits, and there it puts limits on it, and it also puts a tremendous power of abstraction on it. So it's a giant leap, but the value of the spoken never goes away, because we are human beings. We continue to remain human beings even when we become literate. So one of the great things that Walter Ong does is that he says that this quality that David just described of the orality is crucial. And what he's saying is that it's actually when you go to a next step level of digitization, specificity, you actually need more of this to kind of make sense of everything. So you have kind of, and that's what he means by like secondary orality, one that sits on the top of the written that comes in and is able to interpret that. So thank you very much, David. Really appreciate that. Next up is Laura and Jade. Laura, what did you learn from the meetup?
Okay. I want to go back to what you were talking about in terms of language and technology. There's a part of our technology which we haven't addressed, which is the cell phone and the language that gets developed in that through text messaging. There is a language that has been constructed by the users of it, which has actually moved into our written or their written language. And a dictionary has been created for that. And it's, I don't know what kind of language it is. It's a shorthand,
Sure.
It's a laziness. And what do we do with that? You know, I mean, it belongs to a generation of people. We don't know if it will continue to exist. Maybe it'll grow further. And it seems to be a bastardization. I mean, it's lazy contractions of words. And I don't know, how do we deal with that?
Okay, thank you, Laura. We'll come to that. We'll come to that after we look at language itself. I want to look at kind of earlier versions of it. I want to look at what Walter Ong has talked about it. Only that gives us a good thing. My evaluations are different than yours. I think each of those languages makes some things possible. And I like Marshall McLuhan's way of looking at the technologies. He has this concept of tetrad. He says every technology extends something or enhances something. At the same time, it displaces something while doing that. It actually ends up retrieving something from the past and actually uses that old idea to actually and enhances that. So there is a retrieval of something old. And then fourth one is that when it is used too much, it inevitably causes negative effects. So all those four things happen to each of the technologies. So that's why I think the concept of kind of media, like media ecology and kind of noticing what technology is doing for us and to us is important. But Laura, we will come to the Twitter and that kind of language, but we'll do that a little bit later on. Next up is Jade, Abraham, and Madeline. Jade.
I think my comment is more question. I think because I am one of the people who's not 100% familiar with what you guys are discussing. And if this is something I could go and look up for myself in past meetups, let me know. But it's more like, I want to know, okay, on one level, I just want to make one comment, which is a good conversation in my mind is kind of like externalized metacognition, because someone will help you think about your thoughts, because you have to respond to their thoughts about your thoughts. So it just expands it because it challenges your thoughts with thoughts that you probably wouldn't have come up with if it's a really good conversation. But there's also the concept of media. When I look at media, and I've been expanding my media a lot through different demographics, different, just in general. I'm wondering if this theory takes into account like the cultural variations of spoken word and written word, especially within text. Like there isn't just one vernacular for text, and there isn't one vernacular for English. So it's like, how do these things affect different vernaculars and different populations differently? Or is this a universal concept with how these things impact language? So I don't know, because like if you're using a language that has colloquialisms, like the switch to something like to Facebook or text probably isn't that as like to text talk isn't quite as dramatic as one who speaks like, I don't know, a Shakespearean play and is like has a huge vocabulary. Like that shift isn't going to be that big. So, and metacognition is basically thinking about your own thinking. Is the easiest way to say it. Somebody asked, but it's like, I think those are the things that I'm kind of thinking about, and the difference with how people go things, because there is a saying that literate people are people who are in the abstract are easier to fool with words than people who are not, who live in the concrete world. So it's like, how I'm wondering if this has any variations within there for stuff like that. Maybe not, maybe, but I feel like usually are specific analyzing a specific group, but that might not be the case.
Wonderful. Thank you.
That's
Thank
it.
you, Jade. Excellent. Always great observations. So I want to relate to three things. Firstly, I want to say that I don't know much about language. Okay, I'm trying to learn. That's why I'm doing these meetups. So I studied these great ideas, 103 great ideas of Mortimer Adler, where they collected all the thinkers and identified the key ideas that they talk about. And of all the ideas, language is the most fascinating, where I think just so much there, and that it's just mind-boggling to me. No matter how much time I spend on it, it's just so large. So first thing, I don't know much. Second thing I want to say is that I really like your term of externalized metacognition. And I'm hoping to talk a lot about that, because I think it's all about, that's one of the key points that Walter Ong makes, is that language is not just you. It is you talking to other people, and more importantly, listening to the other people and responding and going back and forth. And in that connection between two contexts through language, you can learn a lot. You can really transform yourself. And so that's a key part of the language. It's not a added thing. It's like, that's what language is. You can't really look at language at an individual level. It is individual and social at the same time. The third point I want to make is that these folks study languages, not only dialects, but really different languages. So they will go to Aborigines, they will go to tribes in, in the Amazon. There are over like 1,000 languages spoken today. Only about 100 or 150 of them have written scripts. Rest of them are just oral languages. And if you look at oral languages without any writing, that orality is actually very, very different from me talking. Okay, because what happens is that the writing actually shapes the orality in a dramatic way. So if you, what happens is that things are become, the general thing that is described. So for example, people like Havelock or Ong spend a lot of time trying to understand what was this primary, they call it primary orality. And they make a distinction between primary orality and secondary orality. So what was this primary orality like? And that's profound. I don't think I get it much. You can, because even if you take an illiterate person today, in India, for example, there are lots of people who don't read and write. Still, their language is influenced by the fact that so many people around them are reading and writing, and that language has been influenced by that. So you really have to go to a language where there is no writing at all. And then you can see what the orality looks like. And it is very much closely tied, as you were saying, an abstract person is easy to fool. Orality is far more integrated into your body, into your social interaction. And it is not abstracted out as much. It's the writing that allows that abstraction to a completely new level. It is far more closely tied to percepts. So I would, look forward to exploring all these themes. Next up is Abraham, Madeline, and David. Abraham, nice to see you.
Good to see you. Good to be back. I didn't see the video, but this is a serious topic. Unbelievable. It's so vast that I don't even know why you would do this to our brains. I don't even know. But let me start here. I think without written language, and it's just oral, it may not be that consistent based on what you remember. So the culture will constantly somewhat shift because no one, it changed in interpretation, and then I tell you a story, then you tell the next story. So it's unlike today when I could go back and read what you wrote, and it's much more consistent because now the story can't change. So that's the culture we're living in now. Back in ancient times, only the most elite could read and write. So reading and writing amongst the population is pretty much new within maybe the last 100, 200 years. So I could just only imagine if 400 years ago, 1,000 years ago, if everyone could read and write, where will we be today as far as the information and where we would be starting as a culture and just learning from one another, because it's no longer stories of what you heard and what you remember. And that's why I don't know if we can really justify where we would be as a society if language was the same across the board. I think there's a level of beauty going somewhere and seeing that there is no written language or very little written language compared to digital language, book form, and everything else. But I got to go and look at the video now, and I had no choice because I really want to be on the same page. But this is a great topic, and I can only imagine had they had written language for everyone, not just the elites, 500-600 years ago. Who would we be right now as a society? Because everything's changing. Everything would change. All right. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thanks, Abraham. So I'll say a couple of things. Firstly, I want to address your last point. What if everybody could read and write? And I mean, we are living at a time where not only that, but if you look at of the 8 billion people, the number of people who can now read and write and who have access to libraries, which put libraries of Alexandria to shame on the internet. Everything is accessible to everybody. So what you're thinking of would happen one day is happening now, and we don't really know what are the implications of it. We are living through it, but there is something really big going on because all of us can do that and interact. Of course, many of us will fall back into doing something far more primitive using the same technology. So technology just enables you. You have to choose what you do with it. So that's one point I wanted to make. The second point I want to connect what you were saying with Jade was talking about dialects. So one of the things that happened after writing or standardization, like for example, in England, the number of dialects, just the spoken dialects, were so large before the standard King's English became common. So there is a tremendous variety. Even like, one of my favorite movies on this language is called My Fair Lady. And the professor there is able to tell, from block to block in London, and definitely like village to village, what village they are from, just by way in which you speak. So there is a tremendous richness. And so there is and you can see that in India, for example, there are all these languages now, all these dialects, and they bring richness to it. So there is value in the orality, and there is value in the literacy. And it's that dance between them to kind of appreciate both the power of literacy and the power of orality. That's what I like about Walter Ong, because he's saying all of it is interpretation, and you just try to scale it up. If you can actually talk. I mean, for example, this Mortimer Adler, when he has his book set, he uses the term great conversation, because he imagines that all these great thinkers are actually talking to each other. And if you think about it, that's what actually they do. They actually look at all the thinkers before that and have a conversation with them. And the idea of conversation, I think, is very, very powerful, because it is that loop, establishing a loop with another human being to correct your own biases, to expand your context, because you see some context which is not yours. So it can be done both orally and in writing. And So it's just incredible. And the most interesting thing is that I really want to figure out what's going on here on Zoom in these conversations, okay, that we are engaged in. All of us read, okay, all of us are big fans of reading. We read a lot, and then we come and talk at a very deep level about things that we are reading. We come from very different backgrounds, we have different viewpoints, and we interact with one another. What is going on here? I would like to know. It's amazing, okay, it's amazing, but what is it? And how is it different? Being able to put that in words, we are able to do that in actual action, but to capture that in words. So that's another thing I'm hoping to do. Next up is Madeline and David. Madeline.
Yes.
Just a second, folks. At this point, anybody is welcome to talk about anything about language. Just give your best thoughts about language. Okay, Madeline, go ahead. Sorry about the interruption.
Yes. So Walter Ong, Marshall McLuhan, and them all seem very focused on orality and literacy. And Shrikant, I'm glad you raised the point of those were preceded by mimetic culture. And Abraham basically mentioned something else that I wanted to say something about, which is scribal culture. Only a few people can read and write. And so basically went mimetic, oral, scribal, literate, and now whatever we're doing. I think that with TikTok, we're seeing a resurgence of mimetic culture.
Very good.
It's being done remotely.
Mm-hmm.
It's everything from how to do this dance to how to cook this meal to, how to do a prank on your brother or whatever it is. You don't need to know any language in order to understand it. I think that in the digital age, there is a scribal culture emerging. It's extremely specialized. It's the computer coders and the legal people, like who are in intellectual property rights. These are the scribes who are creating and managing the underlying language of the whole thing. And I think that also with digital culture, the whole thing can be done orally. In other words, you can speak something into your phone or into your computer for a search. And when you get the results, you can request that it be read aloud to you. So it could actually it could be a Library of Alexandria for everyone, or it could be an increasing gulf between a scribal elite and then a lot of users who just don't want to be bothered. They want to do the mimetic thing and the oral thing.
Wonderful, great observations, Madeline, and look forward to exploring all of that. I fully agree that TikTok is mimetic culture, just scaling up, and that's what is great about this, internet as a technology, because it allows kind of pretty much every level in anything that you want to flourish, to kind of you can connect to other people who want the same thing. So and it applies at every level. So that's great observations. Let me go to the next person, David, followed by Will. David.
They're trying to get sound. Okay.
Yes.
I guess the video stirs a lot of thoughts. I'm interested to see where the group is taking this. I mean, I'm not sure that I'm as aware of these radical changes as I hear, because I think there have been so many modes of communication that we're used to and maybe not paying as much attention to, but their effectiveness. So I look at language starting as immediate, that we have the immediate knowledge of the languages. I don't think we've lost this idea of this immediate state of consciousness being given to another in an exchange, and that this transmission can be with another, which is the fundamental, or with a group, or receiving from a group. So the fact that those forms are fluid, it doesn't matter what the sounds are, the way we do it, we all have certain fundamental things we do with each other. And a lot of getting together in a group is not communicating abstractions and facts. It's a lot of just being in a group and sensing what it is in a group. And it's different in person and not in person, but I'm not sure if these, I'm not sure. Yeah, I hope the group helps clarify the differences. I mean, I see, like 6 or more stages as part of a communicative transaction, which is a consciousness which generates with its intent, its thought, its sense, and then it's expressing this, which is its action, which is based on its model of the mind that it's reaching out to the other in anticipation that there's a structure that can be conveyed, right? And then it's outside that person in a transmitted medium. There's a medium, sound, words, text, graphics, dance, music, whatever it is, it's language. So maybe I'm being too expansive with my definition of language, but I find music is as communicative as poetry. So the nature of that medium, how different is the digital medium from other medium? See, I'm not that sure how different it is. Once you have a printing press, you've done a lot of maybe the reduction and damage that you see in a digital medium, but it's combining a few other elements. So I'm interested to hear what people think. So the medium, each medium has its own norms, right? Whether repetition and beauty is part of it. So, scales and harmony are meaningful in music. Emojis are now meaningful in texting. That's how that medium functions, because it's abstracted from the consciousness of one person into something apart from that person. It's in an object. It's outside the person. It's outside the recipient too. So we're now traveling between the transmitter and the recipient. And while it's in that mode, it can be looked at and frozen. So this is what a written medium is. This is what a digital medium is. It exists and can be stopped and saved and examined and looked at for other meanings, or for its literal meaning, or for how it represents abstractions, how music has its structure and rhythm and instantaneous meaning. Once it's kept in that form and used repeatedly, then you have a hermeneutics of it, which is go back to it and examine it as what it is, how it means what it does, and how from the cultural fixed point that it came out of, how it can evolve in meaning too, and what the culture was aware of and not aware of imposing in that medium. Then comes the reception, because language has to get to a person or a group. So the reception is the ability to recognize the intents and those symbols, and those are put through the model of a mind of another, put these out for me to receive. What would that have meant for that have been done for me to get? So that's translated, that's the interpretive phase. And then the response is generated in the returning consciousness. So that's the one way part of conversation. And then it's, of course, the language goes back and forth, and dialogue and logos is the exchange. So it's how does the structure of one person, which was used to project to a structure of another, allow the structure of the second to come back to the structure of the first, so that they can rejoin and couple the similarities or differences that, in other words, dance together in the communication of language. It's anyway, that's what I'm thinking about.
David, that was beautiful. That was beautiful. I think that's exactly what Walter Ong is getting at. That it is the dance. That when he talks about, he talks about language as interpretation. So what you're doing is that you're interpreting other people. You're interpreting the world. You're interpreting the world together. And it's all a dance. It is using, and it's a massive scale. It's the digitization which makes the scale possible, that you can dance with so many people. Like you can't dance with so many people without, yeah, go ahead, David.
Well, you interpret in order to express yourself so that it'll be recognized, and you interpret what you see expressed. So it's both interpretations going on. Yeah. Exactly. And the entire, and the core thing that he's saying is that you are formed through this process. This is not like you are formed and then you do this. No, you are actually formed by this process. This is continuation of the work of Julian Jaynes, for example. Like we had Bill Rove, and he was talking about how
consciousness develops in children, infants, okay? And he had this, it's a very famous video of this mother and daughter. And daughters or children, infants, learn by going back and forth. It's a dance. And the researcher asked the mother to stop reacting. And it's the hardest thing to see. The kid is heartbroken. It's like the whole world has come to an end. But it is that dance, which is the foundation of the infant's ability to cognate, to think, to understand. And then words come on the top of that. You know, sounds initially come. So I certainly think that music is like that. It's even speech of a good person who is particularly good at oral communication has a kind of a music to it. It is crescendos, you know, it moves up and down.
Well, in that mother-child interaction, it's as much as the mother reacts to the child starts at a certain age to do the same thing. So it becomes a more mature level.
Exactly.
I get to do that. I get to do that. I mean,
Yes.
I have the most repetitive grandchild you can ever, everything you say, whether he knows what it means or not, you know, repeat these complicated things, real, and that's incredible. It's a mirror.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, David. Next up is going to be Will, followed by Mike. Will.
So, you know, I am very interested precisely in that. You know, it's the unsaid. Now, there is a language there. But before we get to the silence, we'll continue with the music, and that is not precisely what, but how. In the way of our structure of consciousness, in the way that we precisely, David, receive and mirror, we mirror, if we're a good mirror, we'll also mirror how, the how of what it was said. Now that hits us in a certain area of our mind. If we're angry, we have a vibrational frequency tone of our voice that inserts, and we know. So I'm very interested in the musicality of different languages. French is very flowing, but then I'm interested in the unsaid of the language, because I think that in as much as there is a certain essence of English that is lost in translation to any other language, there's also an essence of the silence of what the English language does not say that is lost in translation. And then lastly, I think that, as Lacan says, the unconscious is structured as a language. Now then, how then are all of our unconsciouses across cultures structured? So these are questions that I'm interested.
Wonderful. Thank you, Will. Thank you, and welcome to our meetups.
Thank you.
So I think I want to address a couple of points. One is the point about unsaid. I mean, there is the distinction that let's take, you know, Gestalt and let's take Carl Jung, right? So Gestalt talks about figure and ground. Figure is what you're paying attention to, things that are clear to you. But the figure always exists within the ground. The ground is actually the base for figures, and you can't really understand the figures without the ground. But by focusing on the figure, the ground recedes into peripheral vision, whether at a perceptual level of our eyes or the way we hear actually, or our concepts. And one of the points of Walter Ong is that you have to go back and forth, or Marshall McLuhan, you have to go back and forth between figure and ground in order to revitalize the figure, because there is tremendous amount of things which are unsaid, unrecognized, unidentified in the unconscious, which are the rich context, which are making what you're looking at possible. That's how it operates. And you can't really ignore that. Carl Jung talks about the self and the ego. It's the same idea that you have to respect the self. You have to respect everything that is at the periphery or below your consciousness, whatever you're not conscious of, and be open to these murmurings or whispers, sometimes booming voices coming from the unsaid, and be willing to encounter them. And that is the thing that actually moves you forward. One thing I want to say is that, again, we're talking about communication between people. That's the, in the division, it's like yourself and then with other people. Interesting thing is that this ratios of what is conscious for people and unconscious is different from person to person. So one very quick way of discovering things that you don't know, that you may not be aware of, is to talk to the people, because they're going to be aware of different things. And if you're actually listening to them, most people don't listen to people. Okay, it's very difficult actually, because you're trying to, as David was saying, you're trying to, I mean, this is again Julian Jaynes' idea, is that of, your consciousness is like having your mental space where you are working out who you are and what you're doing, and you're kind of telling a story to yourself. The other person is doing the same thing. And in order to actually communicate, you kind of have to figure out what is their story. What is it that is going on in their heads? Not just the words, because if you can always interpret the words with respect to your own story and say, oh, that's what they're saying. But no, if you actually want to dance with the person, if you want to actually interact with the person, you kind of have to know what is going on inside their head. I'm not particularly good at doing that, but I know that that's what you need to do in order to have a real conversation, which is kind of life-giving. I like, people like Carl Rogers, who talk about authentic relating as a way of enhancing the self, just by connecting deeply to another human being in a very honest way and kind of a benevolent, open way. It can be profoundly beneficial to you and to others. And that is because there is this differences. Next up is going to be Mike, followed by Jade. Mike.
Yeah, I like talking about music and languages. I think music is a universal language like mathematics. And I found it's interesting to study how musicians acquired that language over time. So if you go, say, in the 1950s, here in the States, there was pretty much, I think, maybe 3 ways you acquired the language. You could read music in print, you could watch musicians live, or you picked up and put down the needle on vinyl countless times to kind of listen to what the musicians were playing. I didn't really think there was any other way to acquire the language of music. Of course, you need to play your instrument. And then today, I think instead of finding information, now it's a skill to filter it. For example, a nice little activity I like is to pick any song that you like and then go on YouTube and listen to it in 7 or 8 different genres being played. And if you wanted to learn how to play a guitar solo in any genre, you might have 30 or 40 or 50 videos of somebody doing something where you can slow it down. And I always found it very interesting if you could go back in time and talk to somebody in 1950 who was lifting up that needle to an 18-year-old musician today who can literally click a button and watch it done in real time. I think that's a very interesting dynamic.
Wonderful. Thank you. I mean, it's just huge. I mean, I'm into Indian classical music, and there is really no option like music. You really have to listen to a lot of it, and you have to produce a lot of it. And as you do more, you take in more and sing more, you put layers and layers in your brain, and develop a skill, kind of a flow on it. And every time you sit down to sing, all of that comes back. It's all there. And that's very, very powerful. And I don't know, like the way in which they did it in olden times in India, they would go and stay with the guru, get up early in the morning and sing from morning. I don't know how they did it, but the way they sing is not like opera where it needs to strain so they would sing like typically, like I remember one of the top musicians was complaining. He's in his 70s and he says, okay, this time I sing only like 8 to 9 hours a day. And when I was younger, I was able to do 16 hours, So that's what they did, listen and sing. And we have the advantage of not doing that exclusively and having the entire world open to us. Let's do one thing, Jade. Let's do the breakout rooms and then we'll come back. Folks, what we are going to do now, this is such a large topic, okay? We've just begun to explore it, okay? So go into the breakout rooms for 20 minutes, talk in the small group, try to come up with the best question you possibly can about language. Okay, just one question per person. We'll collect all the questions and then we will try to answer them in a lightning fashion. Everybody gets to answer the questions. Okay, so that's going to be the lightning round. And don't worry, this is going to be a series of meetups. We're just getting started. This is based on one of the meetups that we did on Walter Ong. The other author and Sara are going to come back and we're going to do one more meetup on that. We are exploring the language through Julian Jaynes. I strongly recommend our Julian Jaynes videos on 52 Living Ideas on YouTube. And on the kind of technological levels, there is a playlist for Center for Study of Digital Life that has got incredible series of meetups on what happens to consciousness as the technology changes. We've covered that really, really well across like 8 to 9 meetups. So for that, I would do that. But let's now go discuss amongst ourselves and come back with the best questions that we can, starting the breakout rooms now. Welcome back, folks. Welcome back. All right. So it is time for questions and the lightning round. So let's get started. So folks, go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to put a question on the table. I'm going to collect all the questions. I'm going to try to formulate them as clearly. I'm going to write them down and then I'll raise them one by one and everybody gets to answer the question. So go ahead and type exclamation mark if you'd like to put a question on the table. David, go ahead.
Yeah, our group was like nonstop. We had 100 questions, so I don't know how to reduce it down here. I think our group wanted to put the brakes on how fast things spread and change, and what we might do to just take a moment and reflect on what is happening to us as the media evolves so quickly. Like I said, Facebook. I heard a comedian this week. Facebook was originally a girl rating site at Harvard. It was just a real low-level, scummy, boys club thing. Why should that grow to become one of the most powerful social media forces in the country? And look what happened, because there was nothing reflected about its values and what it's really for. What it originally is for is not a social purpose that we might want to grow. And look at what it became. So this becomes a question of mastering these media as they take over. Part of our consciousness, as you said, is formed by the medium we're participating in. So how do we maintain self-mastery, right? And have these things which you would think unify us, not polarize us. And to me, this came down to, well, it's about valuing our communities and caring about it.
No answers, just the question.
Okay. So how can we replace these fake communities where I don't really end up with a connection to the people I'm meeting, to real community where where you need help, I'm going there.
Okay, fantastic. So I'll put it in a broad way. So how do we maintain self-mastery and real community
Yeah.
in the midst of this technological extravaganza? Let's put it that way.
Yeah, we have to know what's going on. How do we do that?
No answer. It's a question. I think this is a good question, right? What do you think? Okay. All right, folks, just the question, please, at this point. Then we'll do the answers fully. Kevin, followed by Jade. Kevin.
Yeah, during our breakout room, we managed the meditation. Could be another kind of language. They meditation.
Kevin, can you speak into the into your mic?
Yeah, the meditation bring out happiness, right? So that's a general term. So my question is, what kind of language bring us happiness?
Okay, what kind of language brings us happiness?
Yeah,
very good. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, next up is going to be Jade, followed by David R. Jade, what's your question? Jade, you need to unmute. Let's see what's going on.
He's muted.
Jade, you need to unmute. Can't hear you.
Sorry. Okay, so my question is about questions. So it's basically, I was having a conversation before I came here about people not understanding each other. And I was suggesting that the natural thing to do is to ask a question about what you don't understand. And they were kind of like not understanding the concept of asking questions about what they don't understand. It was more kind of like, I don't know what it was. But my question is, why don't we ask questions, or why the hesitancy with asking questions? And also social things, like cognitively, what's the block? Not socially necessarily, but the cognitive blocks to recognizing that a question needs to be asked. Because I feel like that's an interpretation language type of question. I don't know what it is, but something.
Wonderful.
Does that make any sense?
Fantastic question. So why don't we ask more questions? Let's put it this way. I'm trying to keep questions very simple so that people will be able to talk about them a lot. So why don't we ask more questions? Next up is going to be David R., Will, and Abraham. David.
So my question is, with our emphasis on electronic and digital media, will it survive into the future? And can it be interpreted, or will it be understood?
Okay, will the digital media survive, and can it be understood? Okay, very good. Next up is going to be Will, Abraham, and Alex. Will.
So my question is this: what is the meaning of the language of silence?
Okay, very good. What is the meaning of language of silence? Very good. Thank you. Next up is going to be Abraham, followed by Alex. Folks, if you have questions, go ahead and type exclamation mark. Abraham.
I think my question almost answers somebody else's question. But my question is, I am not, Meetup is the only social media platform I'm on. So I am not up to date with any of these other languages. Am I going to run into trouble in the future because I don't care about any of those? None of them, I really don't. Now that you guys bring this up about language, I'm like, hey, am I going to fall behind and not be able to stay up with society? And I almost don't care if I do or not.
Wonderful. So will you run into trouble if you do not use some of the modern media? Modern media. Okay. Very good. Next up is going to be Alex, followed by Joe. Alex.
Yeah, I was wondering to what degree our desire to communicate to the greatest number of people possible what's that going to do to the content of what we're actually saying or the way it's understood? Is it going to be diluted to the point where it's not about the content anymore? It's not about the message. It's just about the fact of communicating something.
Okay. Alex, I did not get it well enough. Can you repeat it, please?
I'm lost in communication here. I'm wondering whether our desire for communication is going to be more important than the actual message that we're actually communicating. I mean, I think I've just become an example of this.
Okay.
Whether it's the desire to talk as opposed to the desire to be understood.
Okay, as opposed to desire. Okay, very good. Desire for communication. Okay. Okay, this is really fascinating. Okay, desire to be understood. Okay, very good. Okay, thank you. Next up is going to be Joe.
So I'm trying to think this out loud, so maybe you can help me. What is the role of memory in oral versus written culture?
Okay, very good. What is the role of memory? Okay. One of the questions I'm going to put on the table, because of what both David and Jade said, is that what is a great conversation between two people look like? Because there are some very interesting points that David was making and Jade was making. Jade was saying that this is kind of external metacognition. David was describing it as a dance. And I think that really captures the kind of it raises the question about, so what is a great conversation between two people? What are the characteristics of it? What does it look like? Okay. All right. So we got quite a few questions. All right, so let me try to organize it. So there are questions about the media, right? So there is, how do you maintain self-mastery in the, and real community instead of fake community in the current technological environment? Okay, will you run into trouble if you ignore all the modern media? Will the digital media survive and can it be understood? Okay, I want to keep these questions towards the end because they are about the current technology. And what happens is that generally it is very difficult to get a perspective on our current time. It is much better to kind of start with an earlier time, understand the patterns over there, and then maybe we'll have some hope of talking about the current time. So I want to put that at the end. What kind of language brings you happiness? Why don't we ask more questions? What does a great conversation look like? What is the role of memory? And, is the desire for communication kind of overwhelm what is actually communicated? And is it desire to talk versus desire to listen? So I want to take these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions together. The role of memory, also I'll put it with the other one because I want to integrate the role of memory into the technology. So let's look at just the nature of language. So let's look at all of these together. What kind of, so what's a good conversation? Is it about desire for communicate? Is it more about desire of communicating rather than what is being communicated? Then you got, what is the meaning? Oh, what is the meaning of the language of silence? That's also beautiful. I'll put it along with that. So we got 6 questions. So let's see. Let's start with Kevin's question, which is a quite kind of open-ended question. What kind of language brings you happiness? Okay, or what about a language? So connection between language and your happiness or your values. What does language do for you? So just, you can interpret it as broadly as you want. If you would like to answer, try to keep the answer short because we want to answer all these questions, okay? We're going to answer all these questions. So try to be short, but say your piece. Okay. So next up is going to be, so the question on, what kind of language brings you happiness? It's going to be Joe followed by Madeline. Joe.
This is going to sound kind of corny, but it is body language, and it's seeing either relief or the ability to somebody smile is a form of communication, and that to me is what brings me happiness. So
thank you. Next up is going to be Madeline, David, Will, Abram, and Kevin. Madeline.
Yes, that Kevin's question makes me think of the session that Aidan Moore did on nonviolent communication, which does indeed seem to increase happiness. It's specific techniques of listening and questioning and speaking. I also wonder, now I'm just kind of adding to Kevin's question with another one, which is, what would it be like if we worked consciously to develop a language that contributed to happiness?
Okay. Next up is going to be David, Will, Abram, and Kevin, and Jade. David.
Yeah, well, I think for me, it would go pretty quickly to music would be a great medium. The possibility of poetry, speech, any kind of communication, but music works so well for me when it's beautifully conveyed, and conveying a story like dreams are ideals. Sounds a little sappy, but you sigh. That's what makes me feel hopeful and have hope for humanity.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. Next up is going to be Will, followed by Abram. Will.
The language of love.
Wonderful. Next up is going to be Abram, followed by Kevin.
I'm not sure if I misunderstood the question, but what makes me happy is clear communication. When I know that we both understand each other, I'm very happy. I am very happy.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you, Abram. Next up is going to be Kevin, followed by Jade. Kevin.
Hey, Abraham, my answer totally opposite to what you say. Imagine you and me both speak a different language. We visit Indian. We just curious each other. We write, dance, then use body language. We just love each other. No matter what you say, I love it. That's the moment I would say curiosity to an opponent.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Next up is Jade.
I would say that Abraham took one of the answers, because I want to say language that understood. My second one was language that isn't overly regulated. Usually makes people happy when they could just say what they're going to say the way they want to say it.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Excellent. Alex.
Yeah, I think that language, which is like a kind of a universal silence, when you're kind of watching a performance or something like that, someone talks about music or a dance performance, I really like those, where the kind of audience kind of, has this kind of understanding without any words at all. It's kind of a, but it's, you can feel the kind of, that you're all understanding something.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you. Let's see. I'm going to take the next question is going to be Alex's question. I'm going to try to say it, and then Alex, you can elaborate on it if you want. So first, one way of saying it is to say, does sometimes desire for communication become more important than actually what is being said? That's one way of putting it. Another way of putting it is that does desire to actually say something is more prominent than desire to listen? Is that what you're saying? Okay, very good. So go ahead. So those are the questions. Go ahead. Is it, so anybody who has answers, go ahead and type exclamation mark about the desire for communication and desire for listening. Go ahead and type exclamation mark.
Can you say it one more time?
Okay, so let's go one by one. Okay, so So one part of it is to say that, many people have sometimes desire to speak and not much desire to listen in communication. So what is that phenomenon like? So any comments on that? Okay. The second one is that sometimes there is a desire to communicate, but you are really not caring about what is being communicated. It's that. So the relationship between that. So those are the two different questions, but you can address any one or both of them. Next up is going to be David, Jade, and Laura. David.
Oh, I go first. Okay. No, I think that communication is more important sometimes than what's communicated. If you're not going to a business meeting to speak before you need to know what you need to know, you need to know the person. So you want to hear whatever it is. So, and even that's for listening or speaking, who you are, right?
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Jade, Laura, Kevin, Dimitri, and Will. Jade.
I suspect on some level, everyone kind of wants to, I think on some level, people need to appreciate communication when meme is not seeming to be present, because I think that a lot of figuring out what they are is talking and appear to other people like you're just trying to talk. You're actually trying to communicate something, but it's something that you haven't really figured out to say concisely. But I also think that there is value in just talking just to talk, which is why some people who just like to talk to hear their own voice. If ever with small children, that happens a lot. They really talk to you. They're not really trying to communicate anything to you. They just babble sometimes and be like words, like real words to you. Like children know how to speak. So you try to figure out what they'll be like. I don't want any. And you're like, okay, you're just talking.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Jade. Next up is going to be.
But it could mean something. I will put that in. So I'm making an assumption.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Laura, Kevin, and Dimitri. Laura.
I think sometimes people are afraid of the silence, so they feel they have to break it by speaking.
Excellent.
That's it.
Excellent point. Thank you. Next up is going to be Kevin, Dimitri, Will, Joe, David, Norton, and Julie. Kevin.
I would say listening and understanding is so key between followers. If you want to delight to speak, let's see how powerful listening, and understand another side.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kevin. Next up is Dimitri, followed by Will. Dimitri.
Yeah, so very briefly, to answer the first question, not the second one. If 5 people are sitting in a group and they're each making individual statements, right? Because, each one of them is waiting for this other person to finish speaking, and then, they want to start speaking. So if 5 people are each making one individual statement, you end up with 5 individual statements, right? But if you really have active listening occurring, then you start having, the saying, the sum is greater than the sum of the parts, or whatever. So then you ultimately may end up getting like 15 or 20, right? Because everyone's idea starts, language communication starts kind of rolling into a bigger boulder. So yeah, if you have active communication, active listening, much better for communication. That's
excellent. Thank you, Dimitri. Next up is Will, followed by Joe. Will.
I assume Alex meant listening to others, but we must remember that sometimes we talk and we don't listen to ourselves. So I would want to say that yes, it is extremely important even to listen and not speak at all sometimes.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Joe, David, and Julie. Joe.
I see it as the ability to listen to be a distinct advantage, because most people are looking to speak and they know what they're going to say prior to what you're going to say anyway. So the ability to listen is what is really critical.
Wonderful. Next up is David Norton, followed by Julie. David.
Yeah, I believe that what you were talking about here in the questions is miscommunication, because when you have miscommunication, you don't listen to what the other person says. You want him to answer wherever you want to. And the only solution I've ever found for that is asking a question sincerely to want to know what that other person is about. And when you have two people doing that with each other, then they're both involved in listening to the response that each other is given to each other, and you have true engagement, and you overcome that situation.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, David. Next up is going to be Julie. Julie, go ahead. Julie, you need to unmute yourself. Julie, your sound is not working. Okay, there is something wrong with your sound. I can't hear you. Okay, so let's go to the next question. So I'm going to take the question about questions. Why don't we ask more questions? What stops people from asking questions? Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you'd like to share. Okay, it's going to be Abraham, Joe, Patricia, Laura, Dimitri, and David. Abraham, go ahead.
Yes, I think that's a good question. But I find that we don't ask more questions because of culture. And we're taught as a child, don't question authority. And it really takes its toll on us, because as we get older and go into corporate America, whatever, we already know not to question authority. That's one. Number two, a lot of times people don't ask questions because they have fear of looking unintelligent. So they don't want anyone to shine a light on them. So they stand back and just nod their head and go on. So I think those are the two reasons people don't ask questions.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Joe, followed by Patricia. Joe.
Yeah, I think it's primarily an ego issue where we're afraid of, being embarrassed and admitting we're making ourselves vulnerable and admitting what we don't know. So therefore, you have to be pretty confident in what you do know in order to feel confident to ask questions. So yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Next up is going to be Patricia, followed by Laura, Dimitri, David, Michael, Mike, and Madeline. Patricia.
Yeah, I'm in the same mind of, people are afraid of looking stupid, but I think a lot of times people aren't really fully listening enough to know that they need to have more information and need to ask a question to continue the conversation. It's poor listening leads to poor questioning.
Wonderful. Laura, why do you think people don't ask more questions? You need to unmute yourself.
I think it's two reasons, actually. We're not quick enough because you have to be able to listen and think of a question at the same time. And that's hard for some people to do. So I think that's one reason we may not do it. And I think the other one, again, is also, like they're saying, an ego thing. And the third thing is, there may not be something conducive in the room to asking questions. So that might be another issue.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Next up is going to be Dimitri, followed by David. Dimitri.
So I was going to say exactly what Abraham said. He said it very succinctly. So I'm just going to say ditto. But Abraham, hopefully, you mentioned you're only on meetup.com. Hopefully, you know what that, ditto means. It means, right, that.
I am sure Abraham has heard of ditto. It's
from a communication and language point of view, I just want to make sure I got my message across. So.
No, that was the language when we were young. They didn't say copies; they said dittos. Make a ditto.
Yes, ditto is old, and I'm a big fan of looking at the history of words and where they came from. So ditto is pretty old. It's like, the young folks today think that they have invented everything, but no. Some words have been invented before.
Hey, I thought Pokemon created ditto. But anyway.
Thank you. Next up is going to be David. David, go ahead.
Yeah, I just go along totally with what Abraham and Dimitri just said, because they far as I'm concerned, they both nailed it right there. And I mean, that there is the whole issue right there. It stems from that and goes throughout your life like that.
Wonderful.
Period.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is going to be Mike, Madeline, Will, Kevin, Julie, David, Jade, and Abraham. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, by the time it got to me, I was going to just say, you guys already said it. I think most of the time people are afraid to feel silly, but also I think it wasn't mirrored enough in their life. If you have a great conversationalist in your family, you watch all the good, really good ones, they ask a ton of questions. That's how conversations flow. So I think that's one reason they just haven't seen enough of it.
Wonderful. Next up is Madeline, followed by Will. Madeline.
Yes, I agree with everything everyone has said so far. It's a variety of ways of looking at Jade's question about questions. I would just add to it that another reason could just be lack of imagination. There are people who just don't naturally think like, what are the possibilities? What else could be done? Because in a way, that's where questions come from, is to say, it's to use your imagination.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Will, followed by Kevin. Will.
I think sometimes people don't ask questions because it's the lack of imagination, because they don't imagine that they don't know something. Or in other words, they think they know it all.
Thank you. Next up is Kevin, followed by Julie. Kevin.
From a different perspective, think this. It's kind of a culture changing, you see. In these days, like we like fast food, or you want to cook your meal with health food. Quick, fast, efficient. So that's the word. Not like a security trial. Talk to judge with, who is right, who is wrong, pursue the truth. Those days gone. It's sad. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Next up is Julie, followed by David, Jade, Abram, and Alex. Julie.
It's the same answer for the first two questions and this one, is because we live in a world that's really lost, and it's upside down, it's fear-based and full of lies, like basically we're not okay unless this or unless that, and feeds, we don't have our values right, which is why competition and technology communication is more important than connection and communicating with other people. And the reason why people don't ask more questions is because it's more important to be right than to understand someone, because we're upside down. It's not going to work forever, though. It's stopping already. COVID is helping.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie. Next up is David S. and Jade. David.
Right. I can't disagree with the answers that have been given along the lines of, if you're looking stupid, we're socialized, we're afraid of asking or making people uncomfortable, and it's difficult to create questions. But I think the other thing is that we know if we open the shell, we're going to have to go in and look at, what it reveals to us. And that means we're asking to start the work, to confront what we've passively accepted. Now we're going to have to confront that absurd and redefine what's important. What do we need in the world? Because we're going to have to create the answers and replace it. So yeah, it's a fear of having to use our imagination and to redefine what we're doing.
Wonderful. Jade.
I guess I more or less just would say that I'm glad I asked my question, because everyone's kind of giving me up that makes sense. I think it kind of reconfirms my question about asking questions, because now even that conversation I was having more is so much clearer to understand. So it's like even getting that thing, again, that externalized metacognition, this was something that was beyond the scope my mind could figure out itself. And those two comments, even just about being able to figure out you can't figure out thing, like on some level, I guess people don't ask questions, like I'm learning from you guys. So I guess on some level, people don't, just forgot what I was gonna say, but yeah, it's helpful.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Jade. Great question. Next up is Abram, followed by Alex. Abram.
Yes. Well, what I was going to say is, I mean, it is when you're in that position, it's best for me to create a safe space for people to ask questions. So you model what you want. And if you make people feel comfortable and not going to feel alienated, it takes a while to build that skill, but that's a good way to get people to move forward. You have to build that trust and in them. So that's depending upon your situation.
Excellent.
But that's one thing I do.
Thank you, Abram. Great observation. Next up is Alex.
Yeah, I was just reminded of some graffiti I saw once, which was like, question everything, and then somebody had written underneath, why? You know, so like maybe there are too many questions. I mean, I don't know whether it's just my upbringing, but we were taught to ask so many questions, but nobody has any solutions for the questions we ask. And it's easier in the end to ask questions than to answer them. So just to give another perspective there. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alex. All right, the next I'm going to take the question that was implicit or that both kind of David and Jade kind of alluded to. What does a great conversation actually look like? When you have a good conversation using language, what makes it a great conversation? You can look back at the best conversations that you've had. And when do you say that I am glad to have lived this? This has moved me forward. This has been an experience worth living. So what is that? So what is a great conversation to you? All right, so first up is going to be Abram followed by Joe. Abram.
Well, good question. And this week I had two great conversations. And the conversations, they just had value. And we both took something away from it. And we just learned from one another. And it just was great all over because it just wasn't time wasted. So we walked away with information and there was value. That's a great conversation for me.
Excellent. Next up is going to be Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. With something similar where you are both walking away, learning something new, but also something that inspires the imagination for follow-on action, I think is also important for a great conversation, that something that turns into something real.
Wonderful. Excellent. Next up is going to be Laura, Patricia, Michael. Laura, what's a great conversation to you?
Well, in some ways, these meetups, this can be a conversation, me and everybody else. And when I walk away from these, I always feel like I've learned something very important that I take away that's improved my life in many ways. And I'm very grateful for that interaction. And I feel that I understand how much I don't know and information that I want to gain. So it's very fruitful in many ways. And so I think these are great conversations for me. Me against many, but I'll look at it that way.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Next up is going to be Patricia, Mike, and Dimitri. Patricia.
I think a great conversation is just when both people end up feeling like they've been heard, like they've been able to fully express themselves, they've been understood, and that they can move forward and feel good about themselves and about their relationship.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Patricia. Next up is going to be Mike, followed by Dimitri. Mike, what's a great conversation to you?
I like reminiscing with people, either strangers or people that I know that we've lived through something, even if from different areas. But you watch somebody's eye when you talk about something they experienced in the past that you did too, and they kind of light up. I really dig those conversations.
Wonderful. Next up is going to be Dimitri, followed by Kevin. Dimitri.
Yeah, so maybe I should put the exclamation point a little bit faster, but everything, I agree with everything that everyone said. So I'll add something new. It's rare, and it's not because I'm closed-minded, but whenever I have a great conversation that may change a point of view that I already had. That, you know, where, you know, I can put myself in the perspective of the person I'm speaking to, and my point of view changes. That for me is a great conversation, because I've walked away. Yes, I've learned something, but now I've experienced something, and from another point of view, from the so much so that I've adopted or adapted that point of view.
Excellent. Excellent point. Next up is going to be Kevin, Alex, and David. Kevin.
One measurement is that both sides want to talk again. They want to more.
Okay, thank you. Talk again. Next up is going to be Alex, followed by David. Alex.
For me, it doesn't necessarily have to be something long at all. It can be like, you know, one of those spontaneous moments of communication with somebody in the street, and it can be just like a sudden shared experience. That, you know, that for me can be powerful.
Wonderful. Shared experience. Excellent. Next up is going to be David.
I think I'm thinking back to the latest conversation I loved, which I would say these words come to mind: open, free, unfettered, trust with somebody, some other person who seems to be feeling the same way. So it's engaged, and we can bring our real lives in. And that means, I guess, thinking about, you know, listening to people here, that, you know, means it's been revealing. And I definitely could hear what was happening, you know, and it brought me insight and surprises.
Wonderful, wonderful. So let me just summarize all the answers and we'll move to the next question. So it is something of value. You're learning something new. It affects your life positively. You learn something that you don't know. You feel being heard and understood and able to express yourself fully, reminiscing about common experiences, changing your point of view, being able to place yourself in shoes of other people, something that you would want to do again, a shared positive experience, and open, free, unfettered, and trusting interchange. So these are some of the ideas. Next question is about silence. What is the role of silence in language, in communication? I'm just going to put that as an open-ended question. So go ahead and type exclamation mark. Joe.
There's a saying that nothing is more powerful than the unspoken word. And when I was growing up, if my mother didn't want me to do something, she didn't even say anything, because that means I could have let my imagination go as to how bad it was going to be. So, I mean, if she was yelling, I might do it. But if she didn't say anything, I knew. I was like, oh, okay. So it's very powerful.
Wonderful. Next up is David, followed by Patricia. David.
Well, one thing is, it's powerful to not have to speak in somebody's presence, which can be a response to what you're presented, which gives you both time to feel. And that's entirely different, I think, from what Joe is saying, which I would amplify a little by saying, when you hear someone not saying something, you can feel it's to tell you, or you can feel it's they don't want to tell themselves, or something, you know, it begins to feel a threat. So that's it.
Thank you. Next up is Patricia. Patricia, go ahead.
I grew up always hearing this expression of the silence is deafening. And silence has such power, and what you don't say can, just expresses a huge amount. But also, I think that silence is powerful in making connections with people, because sometimes that's all a person needs. Somebody who's suffering and is in pain, sometimes they just need someone to be able to sit with them and be silent and not try and fill the space. It's like a sacred silence.
Wonderful, beautifully put, Patricia. I want to say one thing. We did a meetup on mindfulness, and this point came up at that point. And the point was that most of the times when we are speaking to people, moment there is a silence, many people feel very uncomfortable and they want to kind of react by jumping in to say something. Doesn't really matter what, just say something, okay? And that's very destructive because you are actually losing something. You're not, it's a negative thing. It's not a, you're actually, you think you're doing something, but you're actually hurting the conversation. So the connection that we are making to mindfulness is that if you're mindful about yourself, you're actually more mindful in the conversations too. You actually, just like in mindfulness, you're kind of respecting your own being. Here in silence, you are respecting the joint existence that you have. And instead of filling that with something meaningless, you trust the nature and nature of the two parties to actually produce something meaningful instead of hurrying reactively to kind of, and nervously to put something in place of what should be. So that's what I would say. Next up is going to be Mike, followed by Jade. Mike.
Yeah, I like the talking about music a lot tonight. I think musicians will tell you that you hear a player and you go, man, that player's so busy. They just don't leave enough space. Like, just like in a conversation with words, musically, you're just saying too much with your instrument. I think it was Wynton Marsalis who said that you got to hang out with the people who play the wind instruments because they have to take a breath every now and then, kind of pretty cool.
Wonderful. Next up is Jade. Jade, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry. So what I'm thinking, kind of, silence requires intuition, and intuition requires the ability to interpret the silence. So if you can't interpret the silence, it's going to make you anxious. People do tend to talk too much or talk more than people would think is appropriate when nervous. And then there's also some silence is a play, and that can make people comfortable. And then the third thing is, I'm going to make a correlation between the babies that you brought up and the fact of the matter that when others start talking, baby was distressed. And think it is distressing because don't know why it was shut down. And again, that brings back to the intuition. Because you don't know why communication is shut down, you're going to try to get going to keep connection. And could be, but that I think.
Wonderful. Okay, so now we're going to take last question. We are running a little late, so I want to just add one last question and just really, really short answers. Okay, so we're going to make this very, very challenging. Okay, so we're going to take this entire conglomeration of questions about modern technology. Okay, and just turn it into a very simple question. Okay, clearly all of us here care about our own self-actualization, actually producing, thinking deeply, connecting deeply, having these deep conversations, learning, keeping an open mind, operating like that, okay? So that's one part. And then there is modern technology, okay, all that there is. So how do you maximize this mode of being, an authentic mode of being, let's call it just authentic mode of being, both at an individual level and at a social level in the modern technology? Okay, just as short answers as possible. What's your solution to doing that? Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you'd like to answer. We'll start with David.
Real people.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. Joe. Joe, you are on mute.
Hi. In today's digital, I think it's a hybrid model. It's this and in person and real people as well.
Wonderful. Will.
We must be mindful of our persona.
Wonderful. Thank you. Kevin.
I would put it two ways. One is the integration. Whatever keep add up, let's say from oral to until today. Another one is give people option. If that's second part of it, I feel we lack of it. We don't value people have option. We are same. Thank you.
Wonderful. So the last thing I would say is that this is a theme of Walter Ong. When I read Walter Ong, the impression that I have is that he's a humanist, and he's looking at all of this, all of language, all of technology, to say, how can we be human at our best while using this technology? How do you do it? And that's what his work is about. His books, his core book is called Orality and Literacy. I strongly recommend it. And if you have not watched the video, go ahead and watch the video by Sara. It's all on 52 Living Ideas. I would also look at the language is a huge topic. I don't understand it. I'm trying to grapple with it. We're doing this whole series of meetup on Julian Jaynes. He has very deep ideas about language. We're doing this meetups with Center for Study of Digital Life, which speaks a lot about these various technologies and how it influences. We're looking at Marshall McLuhan, who was a teacher of Walter Ong. He also has a very rich understanding of all these various technologies and what they do to us and for us. So I invite you to explore these topics with us, on our YouTube, as well as, I'm going to have Sara and her co-author Tom back, and I'm hoping to do more meetups on this theme of orality and literacy and how you can use both these aspects of just the full high definition, full sensory experience of a mimetic and oral communication, and the full interactivity of an intimate conversation with a friend or a loved one, and the precision of language in writing. How do you bring it all together and make it work together, supporting each other instead of fighting each other? So look forward to exploring this with you in the future. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Shrikant.
Thank you. Thank you. Great observations, David. Really like them.
Thanks.
Thanks, Shrikant. Have a great evening.
Bye, Joe.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.